So guys, I thought the best place to start, jumping off what Paige was saying, is, how does your firm view diversity? Do you have, a pipeline of just looking for black founders, just looking for, women founders, or is it very much like Paige, where it's very look at the top, are they a good person, and invest? What does it sort of look like in your worlds? Anyone who wants to jump in first?
I'll kick it off. So my name's May. I'm a director at Tumml, and we're actually based up in San Francisco, but we kind of bring companies from all across the country and the world into our program. So we're actually an urban ventures accelerator with a seed fund attached, and we are looking for transformative urban technologies. So this is everything from transport startups that might be solving traffic congestion issues to energy harvesting technologies that are helping with kind of clean energy. And we've incubated 38 companies over the last 3 years. And of those, actually, a fact that we're really proud about is that 71% of those companies have either a woman or a person of color on the founding team. And that's not something that we've actively controlled for, but it's happened to be a product of perhaps the broad range of applications we get in terms of deal flow. And interestingly also, the 3 members of the Tumml team, including the 2 co-founders, are all women. So it means that we are attracting a lot of candidates who are women, and our board also has a mix of men and women on it. So, we definitely have diverse portfolio, diverse founders, but it's not a criteria we're actively controlling for.
Vaughn?
Vaughn Blake, Managing Director of AutoChrome Ventures. We're a frontier-focused firm, so I focus on VR, AR, AI, autonomy, broad-based, so autonomous mobility, and a little bit of commercial space, a little bit of synthetic bio. Reoriented the fund towards that sort of thematic framework at the beginning of Q2, and I'd say we're about investing 45% of the portfolio companies within that specific framework have an underrepresented founder, women or minority.
You're finding them how?
I don't know. I mean, having a focus helps. I mean, I don't have a mandate or, sort of particularly or specifically reach out or seek out underrepresented founders, but obviously being an underrepresented member of the venture community means that I can sort of empathize and understand, their struggle or perhaps some of the difficulties that they might have had fundraising. But I think having a focus really allows you to sort of separate and sift through founders, regardless of background. That said, I still think, we're, I suppose, probably our portfolio is probably slightly more diverse than most that are focusing on frontier.
Again, I'm Austin Clements. I'm with TenOneTen Ventures. We're actually a very thematic fund. We focus on data specifically. So companies that are building companies with a unique data set that sets them apart from their competitors in some ways. We look at a lot of AI, machine learning companies. Unfortunately, our portfolio is not as representative of the general population as I would like for it to be, or for that matter, that our managing partners would like for it to be either. So, when we're so very thematic, we're already looking at a small subsection of all of the possibilities of companies that we could invest in. And so within that, it's actually very rare that we see someone who fits both our criteria and is also a minority or woman, a person of color. But I view kind of TenOneTen as my first job, and then I have a second full-time job, and that's being a black man in America. And so I think that there's a lot of responsibilities that come along with that. I have a lot more tenure in that job as well. And so, as a black man in America, I think about things from the standpoint of I feel an obligation to support my family, my community, and people at large, and probably in that order. And so when I think about community and what I could give back, how I could support, one of the things that I do oftentimes is meet with people that are outside of the scope of where our fund would invest, but actually take the time to give feedback, and maybe candid feedback that they wouldn't hear from other investors that they're talking to. As I'm sure a lot of entrepreneurs out here know, if you talk to investors, a lot of time you'll get no without any kind of helpful or constructive feedback. And so sometimes, I'll get on the phone, I'll say to people very upfront about that, like, this falls outside of the scope, but I'd love to, if you'd like to take half an hour, I can give you some candid feedback about areas that you might improve. We get on the phone, I say, hey, this isn't a pitch. I hear, a sigh of relief, like, all right, finally I could just talk to somebody that could help out. So I try to do that outside of even the scope of the fund, but still ultimately would love to push more deals led by, to make our fund more representative of the greater population.
So Vaughn, let's say there's two white guys, or a white guy and an Asian guy, that come to you and they've been working in tech for several years. They have a company, they want your money, you like them. Would you, at that point, have you ever, made a suggestion, hey, why not add a third co-founder of a diverse background? Or is that something you would feel comfortable doing?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's really, we're getting into sort of, quota territory. We're getting into, territory that could probably put my fund at I don't know, not in the best position in terms of the way that might sort of spread about the founder community. That said, I have had many discussions with, perhaps the way that it works more is I'm attracted to people that have open minds, right? So, for instance, one of my latest portfolio companies is computer vision, machine learning in the retail space, and after speaking with this founder, was, taken with the team, made a lot of progress. I got into the round, and then he sort of proactively reached out to me, asking for help finding female and underrepresented engineers because he wants his team to be more representative of the world. He thinks that it's, positions them in a better place for success, and positions the team dynamic, in a way that's probably can capitalize on, different perspectives. And, I think that, perhaps having a conversation with founders when you're working at the earliest stages, which I do, you have to get to know them as best you can over a short period of time. And I'm sure that, sensing a lack of open mind is something that maybe I have an unconscious bias towards.
I mean, to either Austin or May, would you make any sort of nudges? Have you made any sort of nudges when you notice a team forming, 2, 5, 10, 20 people, and they all look the exact same when you walk into the office? Do you make a nudge? Have you made a nudge before?
I've made a nudge before. I've walked into an office the first time with about maybe 14 people, and I was like, hey, a lot of white guys in here. And it's a nudge, but it's an acknowledgement that, like, and ideally it would lead to a deeper discussion of really what are the merits.
Did it in that case?
They actually did. Their most recent hire was African American male. So I don't know that my comment had anything to do with it, but I'm sure. But I was quick to hear about it when they did hire him. So maybe on some level it did. I think that. I still think that it is our responsibility as investors to, particularly as minorities, to bring that to people's attention, because if we don't, nobody else will. And so we like to see that when teams get past a certain number of people, really.
Well, everyone says having a diverse team, better ideas, more things. So why wouldn't you make a nudge, May?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in terms of making nudges, I agree that we haven't actively necessarily said, look, you don't have a woman, you should hire, your next hire should be a woman. But I think in terms of thinking about how to nudge companies in the direction of considering questions of inclusion and diversity in their founding team and broader team, it's really important that the funds themselves have people working with these entrepreneurs that are diverse, because naturally the networks that the VCs and accelerator programs have reflect the diversity of those individuals themselves. So we often make recommendations to our companies about great people that they should be talking to for their next CTO or their next sales lead, and they happen to be women or people of color, and that's not something that we are necessarily thinking that the person has to be a woman that we recommend, but because we're women, we happen to know a lot of women or are in communities with, other people that are working in the space. And so I think being able to think about recommending people that that might not have also had an opportunity to have that exposure is really important. I think also the more that we have these conversations around diversity and inclusion, we're becoming aware of, our unconscious biases, and being able to, perhaps as accelerator programs or as VC firms, take our companies through trainings that allow them to understand that this is a thing that really exists, allows them to think broadly when hiring.
Well, I think the point you just made is interesting because it's sort of suggesting a way to dismantle the old boys network is to, have VC funds where oftentimes you guys are making recommendations on or offering leads on who to hire. Do you think larger Silicon Valley firms are actually smarting up to that and they are having sort of diverse teams in their funds? It doesn't feel like it for the most part. Yeah. And how do you nudge those, or do you feel like it's an advantage for you and let them be their old boys network?
You know what? I honestly think that there's a larger trend in venture where, for one, there are a lot of new funds that are starting that are a lot smaller. And I think as more and more funds come on the table, they have to differentiate themselves in different ways. And inevitably, that means that you have to target new underserved populations. I think that what happens is you'll start seeing funds pop up that focus on minorities or focus on women. You start seeing efforts like what Monique is doing and with 500, and as those things take off and as those things show that this is a great place for you to find great deals, then other venture funds will really start paying attention. Honestly, I don't think it's going to be driven by the top long-established funds. I think that it's going to be driven by people like Monique, people like Arlen at Backstage that gain attention and then prove it with the results, and then other people will follow suit.
So then, if you're coming from an entrepreneur standpoint, I assume most of you want to hear the backgrounds of the founders. If they come from an interesting background, very different than what you're used to, you want to hear their stories, you want to know it. But do you think most investors are in that same boat, or do they just want the company and that's all they care about? How has a founder of a different background do you approach an investor of a different background?
In terms of the extent to which one's diversity should play out in the pitch particularly, I think it's very much about getting the fundamentals right. So as part of the story of why you're passionate about this issue or this product, if it directly correlates or is, related to something that you've personally experienced by nature of being a woman or being black or having a sister with autism or whatever it is that you're trying to solve, I think it's really pertinent that comes out in the pitch. We've invested in companies where the founder themselves were unemployed and are now maybe creating a startup that employs unemployed people, or someone who had a mental illness and is now creating a technology solution that tackles that. And as part of the pitch, it's part of the story and it feeds into the passion. But on top of that, you still obviously need to have kind of the market and the product and the other kind of fundamentals when pitching there. It's not enough to just rely on the story, and I think that might differ fund to fund, but from our perspective, we love to hear that story if it's relevant to what you're pitching.
Either of you disagree with that?
I think that there's a spectrum. There are funds I don't know if Paige is still here, but you look at Arena and you just heard his story, they have criteria specifically about the founders, and they're very founder-centric. What's that?
The principles.
Yeah, right. So exactly, they have ideas about how they evaluate founders. I think that there are other funds that are on the other extreme that are very quantitative, that look at a lot of different aspects. Where did this person go to school? Like the very generic aspects of what has created success in the past. And you know, depending on who you talk to, you'll get better results than others.
Yeah, I would say the most important thing to understand and realize as an entrepreneur is who you're pitching. And if you're pitching someone like Arlen or Monique who has the mandate to invest in, you know, underrepresented founders, then both, you know, stress that fact, but also tie it into the story and make it a crucial and integral part of the product or business that you're building. If you're pitching, you know, a couple of guys at Graycroft or, you know, at, I don't know, another firm here in LA that haven't really been particularly public about embracing diversity, then figure out what metric they're going after, and design your pitch around that. I mean, I think that, you know, great founders can always figure out how to tell a compelling story. And
For that particular audience, you mean?
What's that?
For that particular
Yeah,
audience.
exactly. That matches their audience, and it's a super important thing, especially the earlier you are in the sort of life cycle of your business. Most of it's going to be vision. So be able to tell a compelling story and either back it up with numbers or back it up with your experience. But do your homework on the investor that you're pitching.
But like you guys said, I mean, there's a growing number of funds that are open to investing in diverse candidates at the sort of $1 million, $5 million, $10 million check. What happens when you're big enough to need 20 million, 30 million, 50 million? I mean, it sounds like it's a mess out there.
Yeah,
right?
I actually think that's a huge problem, and I think that you know, you have to.
How are you going to solve it?
Well, I mean, I think that's an LP problem. That's a problem with pension funds. That's a problem with foundations and endowments giving, you know, large checks to diverse venture firms. I mean, Monique will get there, Arlen will get there, firms that are focusing on underrepresented founders will get there, they'll have to prove it. But even right now, I think it's still going to be tough for certain types of folks to raise growth, just because of their networks and because of the biases and because those firms tend to be, you know, not to be ultra direct, but older and whiter and maler, you know? It's just the truth. And I do think that, you know, oftentimes, and I agree with Austin, there has to be a groundswell of sort of, you know, bottom-up activity, action and execution, but there's absolutely no doubt that at the very top, folks that are actually pouring capital in to decision makers, or folks that are making the higher corporate boards that are making the decisions at the C-level suite for these larger companies to be, you know, engaged in some sort of, you know, diversity. I mean, if NFL coaches have to, you know, if NFL teams have to interview underrepresented coaches for those vacancies, then I think some of the larger companies and larger funds should too.
Yeah, I think it is a kind of structural and institutional problem. So when you have people at the top of, you know, pension funds, as you mentioned, or your LPs for that matter, who look and talk and mingle with the same people and are not being exposed to different groups, then it is a huge issue in the way it trickles down to the money going to growth stage, I guess, investments. At the early stage, I think perhaps the beauty of early stage is there more is a democratization of seed funding where you have opportunities to use crowdfunding or go to an accelerator program and maybe target angels who have been known to also invest in women or people of color. The more that you grow as a startup, though, and are getting those bigger check sizes and looking for that real kind of push into the mass market, that's where suddenly it's not enough to just have, you know, enough women at the early stage investing or enough Black people. We need kind of institutions to change from the top down as well. And so I think it's a bigger problem for kind of the corporate and technology community as well to be on board. And we all need to be working on this issue together because I don't think it's going to change just from making kind of minor changes at one end of the spectrum and not the other.
But in speaking of minor changes, I mean, one of the things I hear, you know, from people in tech is one of the reasons they leave tech is, you know, there's the snide remarks, the you know, nasty comments, the internet trolls. I mean, everything we've seen the last several months across this country. So, I mean, in the boardrooms, when you visit these companies, I mean, do do anything to, when you hear insensitivities, do you do anything to tamp that down? Are you part of doing that? And does it matter if you do that?
I mean, yeah, I think that's obviously a leadership issue, and if leadership is allowing those sort of conversations or comments to be passed, then they're failing.
Do you call founders out on it? Have
I
you?
mean, if somebody did something, I mean, they would obviously know for me. If somebody, I mean, used language that was inappropriate, whether it be across any group, of course I'm going to say something. I mean, you know, it's a problem of courage if you don't, you know.
I've got a story to share on that, actually. I do think it is important to call out that behavior, and I think it also is not just about the entrepreneurs making those maybe unconscious bias errors, but also on the part of investors. So I've kind of heard from one entrepreneur that we were talking to that they, were sitting with their investors in a board meeting, and the investors were looking over their compensation package as one of their co-founders, and said so this is a female founder and sitting in a boardroom with mostly male investors, and the male investor said to the female founder, as part of looking at the line by line kind of salary, the spreadsheet, so how much does your husband make? And she kind of paused and said, do people ask you how much your wife makes in order to decide what your salary is at your fund? And then he kind of was taken back by that comment, and then it led to a productive dialogue of, wow, I didn't even realize that the comment was making was so gender biased, but you're right, it shouldn't matter whether your husband's working or whether even if you're married or not. And I think it's those micro examples that calling people out, but in a productive way to start a dialogue are really important to have that grassroots movement. At the same time, we need institutional change. And I do think the two should be working kind of in tandem. So that's
in all honesty, I mean, most likely our society's progressed, I suppose you could call that, to the point where most of those comments aren't going to be made around someone like me or May or Austin. So it's really up to folks who are around that sort of behavior to stand up and say something. It's just the reality of the situation.